The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, I am Krista Lutsky with the North American Invasive Species Management Association. And on behalf of NISA Planning Committee, which is sponsored by the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils, we would like to welcome you to the third day of National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Today's webinar is Overcoming Triclopyr Confusion, Safety, Efficacy, and Selectivity Issues for Applicators, presented by Dr. Stephen Enloe. Dr. Stephen Enloe is an associate professor in the Agronomy Department and has been housed in the IFAS Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants in Gainesville, Florida since 2015. Dr. Enloe earned his Ph.D. in 2002 at the University of California, Davis in plant biology. He has been involved with invasive plant research and extension for the past 17 years. His research and extension programs are divided between aquatic and upland invasive plant biology, ecology, and management. And before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping announcements for everybody. We will have all of our attendees in listen-only mode, and you will be muted. So we invite you to type your questions in the questions tab in your webinar control panel. We will go through and try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of his presentation. You are also welcome to post comments in the chat box of your control panel. This webinar will be recorded and posted on NASMA's YouTube channel. So with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Stephen Enloe, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. She is about to share the screen with me, and I will get started here. Okay. Sharing screen number 2. There we go. Okay, you should see the PowerPoint. Somebody type in the chat if they can actually see the PowerPoint, please. Make sure we have it up. Yes, okay, excellent. Okay, so who's ready to talk Triclopyr? Happy National Invasive Species Awareness Week. It's good to be here. And we're going to talk Triclopyr today. And Triclopyr is a herbicide that's sort of near and dear to the hearts of a lot of invasive plant managers. And we're going to go through several aspects, some things you haven't thought about, and address some confusion that has definitely been prevalent for many, many years now regarding Triclopyr. Something that also is sort of becoming enhanced by some new additions to our Triclopyr toolbox. So when we step back from Triclopyr for a minute and think about invasive plant management, you know, in terms of the 4 pillars of IPM, chemical control or chemical management are one of those pillars. And we do have a relatively limited toolbox that we draw from for invasive plant control. Things like glyphosate, of course, imazamox, aminopyrrolid, triclopyr, metsulfuron, imazapyr, aminocyclopyrrochlor, and a few others, imazapic, and dazaflam's coming to the market there. But in general, it's a relatively small toolbox of herbicides, and we tend to rely on a few of these extremely heavily, and glyphosate and triclopyr are by far and away the 2 most widely used herbicides for invasive plant management in natural areas here in the United States. Now, as you all know well, glyphosate has a little bit of an uncertain future right now. Over the last few years, we've seen a lot of things come up regarding potential carcinogenicity of glyphosate. We've had 3 lawsuits that plaintiffs have awarded, our juries have awarded the plaintiffs $2.5 billion almost against the companies. Those plaintiffs that claim glyphosate caused cancer. And there's now about 50,000 some lawsuits lined up against the company. And so we just don't know what's going to happen there. The EPA has not changed its stance on glyphosate, but the reality is there are impacts from these that are being felt across the country. Here's just a few media headlines. Martin County stops using glyphosate here in Florida, City of Stuart, Miami, Indian River County. Mayor Jenny Durkin announces restrictions on the use of pesticides containing glyphosate from Seattle. And you can see these types of things popping up all over the country in cities like Boulder and Austin and Davis and New York City proposing it, and many, many places looking to curb the use of glyphosate, especially on public lands. in general. And so this is real. Despite the fact the label hasn't changed, people are feeling this, and a lot of folks are calling us and emailing us and asking for alternatives to glyphosate. So this is a great chance for me to prop tomorrow's seminar, and that is investigating the health effects of glyphosate by a couple of colleagues of mine, Dr. Dan Wickstead and Anthony Hay at Cornell. Strongly recommend you tune into this seminar tomorrow to hear what they have to say regarding glyphosate. So giving a little prop for tomorrow, and let's jump into Triclopyr, because it can be a glyphosate alternative for many, many invasive plants we face. However, the conversation is definitely complicated. We've talked about what we call Garlon 3A for years. We've talked about Garlon 4 or Garlon 4 Ultra. Pathfinder 2 is a version of that. Recently, Tricera has come to the market, and you may not know about that one. Vaselan, another relatively newer formulation of Triclopyr. And lots of generics out there. Once the Amine and Ester formulations went off patent, and a lot of people have confusion. And then you have your sort of your Home Depot box store version of the brush killer like Bayer Advanced. So the bottom line is, when we talk Triclopyr, how much clarity are we bringing to the conversation? Are we saying things that result in more confusion by not clarifying what Triclopyr we're talking about, exactly how we're using it, and really the approach, the methodology, the rates, concentrations, and everything? And in my career, over the last almost 2 decades, I have seen so many people who have been frustratingly confused by Triclopyr formulations. And that was when we just had 2, of an Amine and an Ester. Which one do we use for Basal Bark Treatment? Which one do we use for cut stump? So I've seen that, and now that we have 4, and with an increasing emphasis on Triclopyr that's very likely to come, it's important that we clarify these things. Okay, so my goal for this talk today, to help you understand the differences in Triclopyr formulations. So you can, number 1, select the right one for the job. This is very important. We don't want to be using the wrong formulation. Number 2, so you can effectively train your crews with solid information. And I just can't stress this enough, that it is so important that we get our people trained well so they fully understand everything they need to know before utilizing herbicides in the field for invasive plant management. Maintaining or potentially improving efficacy and efficiency. And finally, maintaining or improving applicator safety. So the bottom line is, I want you to have confidence in these tools, the different Triclopyr tools that are available. Now, let me lay out a little note here. This is kind of the disclaimer, of course. The use of trade names in this talk does not constitute University of Florida's endorsement, and they are used here for clarity, since really they have become part of the Triclopyr lingo. For many, many years, we've often talked about the Amine formulation as simply Garlon 3A. So when I mention trade names here, I'm not advocating one over another, but I'm using them a lot because that's what so many people know these Triclopyr formulations by. Anytime I use one, I will clarify it with the actual formulation so that you are clear on that. Okay, so here we go. Now, this first part is going to be a little on the technical side, because what I'm going to do is go through the basics of these 4 key formulations we now have. So let's start with the good old Amine formulation that we've called it. So here we have our base Triclopyr molecule. We have our classic pyridine ring. Here we have our chlorine atoms attached to it, and then our carboxylic acid group. So this is what we know as Triclopyr. Now, when this form was formulated as an amine, it's formulated as a triethylamine salt, and you can see these 3 ethyl groups associated with the nitrogen here making up the triethylamine salt. So this formulation has always been called the amine formulation, or the triethylamine salt formulation. Now, this formulation has several things on the label that you want to pay attention to. First off is that percent active ingredient, or AI. In this case, it's 44%. It is 31% in terms of acid equivalent, or the AE, and that is the base Triclopyr molecule here, eliminating the triethylamine salt component, which when you add that in, makes up the active ingredient. It is 3 pounds of acid equivalent per gallon in the formulation, meaning there's 3 pounds of Triclopyr in the acid form here within the formulation. You know it as Garlon 3A. There are generics like Triclopyr 3, aquatic versions like Renovate, and other generics out there. This is the water-soluble formulation, okay? Now, we call this, and we often refer to the amine formulation simply as Garlon 3A. That 3A in the name comes from that 3-pound acid equivalent per gallon, and the A in the name comes from the amine type formulation. So that's where that comes from, okay? So this is a lot of numbers to throw at you, but just keep these in mind, and I want you to pay attention to some of the differences you're going to begin to see as we go through these. So the ester formulation, this is the other one that everybody knows or has frequently utilized. Here we have our base. Here we have our base Triclopyr molecule again, and in this case, we've got this butoxyethyl ester tail attached to it. Now, this is sort of like a long, sort of greasy hydrocarbon tail that is attached to this in this form of the ester. And that comes into play regarding its solubility, and also comes into play in regarding the way they can formulate this product. In this case, the ester formulation has a 60.45% AI. That's the equivalent to 43.46 acid equivalent. And this gives us a 4 pound per gallon acid equivalent of Triclopyr, of the base Triclopyr molecule here. You know what is Garlon 4 or Garlon 4 Ultra, Triclopyr 4. It's also the formulation within Pathfinder 2, the ready-to-use formulation. This is the one we say is oil soluble, okay? However, in this case, it has been formulated so that it can also be mixed with water, so it kind of goes both ways. But many people in the invasive plant world primarily focus on Garlon 4 as the go-to for basal bark herbicide applications and some cut stump work. We call it Garlon 4. So when I say Garlon 4, we're talking about that ester formulation, okay? Now, there's a note here. There's XRT, Garlon XRT is basically a juiced up version of the ester formulation coming in at 6.3 pounds acid equivalent per gallon. So it's a more concentrated version. A few things change about that formulation, but I'm covering so much today, I'm not really going to spend a whole lot of time on that one. I really just want to stick with the base formulations here. But if you have questions about it, I'd be happy to answer those afterwards. Number 3, the choline formulation. So how many folks knew there were a choline formulation of Triclopyr out there? So again, here we have our base Triclopyr molecule, in this case formulated as a choline salt. This is a much more recent introduction to the market over in the last few years. And basically, if you kind of look at it, coming out from the same company that introduced Garlon 3A, and so when Dow, which became Corteva, did this, they saw some value and benefit to a new formulation, and so they introduced this choline salt. In this case, it's another higher load formulation. You may have seen Vaslan HL as a trade name for it, or Vaslan. This is a 54.72% AI, 39.02 on the acid equivalent side of things for that base Triclopyr molecule, and this is also another 4 pound per gallon acid equivalent formulation. We got a problem here. Here's a water soluble one that's also a 4 pound AE per gallon. So suddenly, whatever terminology or lingo you were using to separate that 4 pound per gallon Triclopyr ester from the 3 pound per gallon water soluble amine is now going to get messed up with this second 4 pound per gallon formulation coming to the market. And this is going to come into play. Finally, we have an acid formulation. So this is also a recent introduction to the market. Here's our base Triclopyr molecule. No expressed or attached group in terms of the formulation. It is truly formulated as an acid, so you will not even see a percent AI on its label. No active ingredient given, only an acid equivalent. The next thing you'll notice here, it's only 29.4% AE. It's a lower concentrated formulation of Triclopyr acid, and it comes in just under Garlon 3A, which is 3 pounds per gallon. This one comes in at 2.87 pounds per gallon acid equivalent. Trade name on that's Tricera, and this is an interesting formulation. It's intermediate in solubility. It goes kind of both ways. It's soluble in both water and oil. And this has a lot, there's a lot of interesting things with this, and it's going to be very attractive to a lot of managers when we get into this. I'm not here to sell Tricera, but Helen has done some interesting things with this version of Triclopyr that are potentially useful for invasive plant managers. Okay, so we call that one Tricera. Now, let's put this clearly. in my best and simplest explanation. So now we've gone from 2 Triclopyr products to 4, with 2 4-pounders, a 3, and a 1 near 3. The 3 still means 3, the 4 equals oil no longer applies, and the 1 near 3 goes both ways. So whatever terminology you were using to separate these from your applicators and the folks who work for you, you may have to change the way you have described the 3 versus the 4 type language. Okay, so to put it clearly, one does not simply speak of Triclopyr without clarifying the formulation. It's really, really important that we begin to do this in any Triclopyr training that we do, so people understand exactly what it is we are talking about using. In a little more current terms, I would say some of y'all never kept up with Triclopyr tech, and it really shows. Okay, joke's over. The good news here, there are many similarities across these formulations. They're not all horribly different, all right? They all have the same mode of action. So they're auxin mimics, similar to your base Triclopyrs of the Amine and the Ester, and they're gonna operate very similarly to your classic formulations. They're highly flow immobile, so they're absorbed through the foliage, through the leaves, and transported symplastically throughout the plant, primarily in the phloem. So there's going to be some source-sink relationship there that is going to drive the flow of these herbicides throughout the plant. All right. There's no confirmed resistance to Triclopyr for any of these formulations. Thank goodness. We're very happy about that. And there's limited soil activity to no soil activity in most situations. There are a few cases that I'll talk about towards the end of the talk where soil activity can come into play. But overall, you know, we've been very successful in using Triclopyr selectively in many different forest types and natural areas with limited non-target damage from soil activity. It really separates itself out from herbicides like imazapyr or aminocyclopyrachlor, which both have tremendous soil activity. All of these are selective. They control broadly for dicot type species, typically not having a whole lot of injury on grasses or monocots in general. So that's pretty consistent across most of the products. They're also very good on woody species and vines, and they've been a real go-to herbicide for many, many different species. And in the invasive plant world, we know we have plenty of woody species and plenty of aggressive vines that we're dealing with. And Triclopyr is often pretty effective on a lot of them, okay? So the symptomology you're gonna see, this is actually a tobacco plant. It's just a nice, clear picture of auxin type symptomology. You get a lot of things going on here from that auxin type mode of action that's stimulating cell division and cell differentiation and mature tissues. That results in all sorts of leaf puckering and stem twisting and crinkling of the leaves, very commonly that we see on species, and then the stems begin to swell and crack as the phloem get destroyed, and then you get a general browning and death of the entire plant. All right, this curling or cupping of the leaves, this is another very characteristic symptom of the auxin type damage from products like Triclopyr, and that's one of the first things you'll see from a Triclopyr application on a lot of herbaceous species, especially is this type of leaf cupping. Okay, on pine trees, pines can be very susceptible, especially to foliar applications. To new growth, you'll see the candles will twist. You will see them sort of bend over like this. You'll see lots and lots of that going on. You'll see the needles kink up, and then you'll begin to see general browning of the canopy. So very classic auxin type symptomology on pine trees, which are very susceptible. Okay, so a lot more similarities here. I want to go through this because you've probably never done this. Let's go through the labels of these. Let's start with the Triclopyr amine in terms of woody plant species controlled. So what you can see here is that basically we have very few invasive plants listed on this label. Australian pine invasive in Florida, blackberry, we have lots of invasive blackberries around the country, Brazilian pepper invasive in Florida. You got to keep coming down the list here. Look, kudzu, of course, across the eastern United States now is a serious invasive plant problem. Let me see, keep going here. Scotch broom, of course, in the western United States primarily. So Interestingly enough, Dow never put a whole lot of invasive plants on this label. What you can see here is a whole lot of native plants that were indicative of the development of Garlon 3A or Triclopyr amine for the forestry market and for rights-of-ways, the non-crop type market. And this was really developed largely before we even began to think about invasive plants for the most part. So they just never really put a whole lot of invasives on the label. But you can see this common set of species, and as we move to the Triclopyr ester label, in this case Garlon 4 Ultra, you can see I've starred additional species that have been added in addition to all the ones that were on the Garlon 3A label. So box elder, tree of heaven, another invasive there, gorse, another western invasive, and hickory, not an invasive, but something they added in. So basically, between the amine and the ester, we have just a few extra species that were put onto the ester label. Now, if we go to the Vaseline label or the choline formulation, you can see a few more species have been added. The brooms, gorse, melaleuca seedlings, and Russian olive have made it onto the list, in addition to basically almost everything else that you saw on the Triclopyr amine label. And then finally, the Tricera label or the acid formulation, they added in Chinese tallow tree, white tai-tai, with all these similar species coming across here. So what we see here, to put it plainly again, the new 4 and the new 1 near 3 both have a few more species than the old 3 and old 4, but none of them have many of the species that need to be controlled, okay? So that's okay, right? The site of use on the label is what's important here. It's not that actual species list. So any of these formulations, they're all labeled for use in natural areas. They all have strong non-crop labels in general, and they all generally cover the site uses that we are going to have in terms of invasive plants in the non-crop world, okay? And I'll get into that a little bit more here. So it's okay that they don't have every single invasive plant on them. Now, when they don't have an invasive plant on them, it's still legal to use it on the site, but there may be questions or uncertainty regarding the real efficacy on those species. So that's where we have to sort of go beyond the labels and begin to dig elsewhere in terms of extension resources and other scientific publications to ascertain their effectiveness for the dearth of invasive plants that we really deal with. Okay. Now, we got formulations, and formulations always can come with some issues regarding safety among different types of formulations, okay? So I'm going to give you a little trigger warning here. Anyone who is squeamish or just had lunch may want to look away from the computer for a minute. This is the thing with Triclopyr sometime that we are really trying to avoid: chemical burn from an herbicide exposure. Now, this particular one is actually a nasty picture from a paraquat burn. And not a Triclopyr burn, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what Triclopyr actually can do to the eyes for certain formulations. So we have signal words on all these formulations. We have danger, warning, and caution signal words. And what it means for Triclopyr in terms of eye effects. If it has a danger signal word, that means it is corrosive for corneal opacity, and it's not reversible if you don't get it out of the eyes. So really that means permanent or severe eye damage when you have that danger signal word and fail to get that concentrated product out of your eyes. The warning label, again, opacity reversible within 7 days, irritation persisting for at least 7 days with moderate eye damage, and then a caution being no corneal opacity, no irritation, or reversible with none to mild eye irritation, okay? So what is corneal opacity? And again, the cornea, that clear part of the eye that the herbicide formulation can interact with and begin to literally scar, resulting in this cloudiness that overcomes it. And so when this happens, it's irreversible. That scarring, it cannot, it's pretty bad. And it's something we certainly don't want to be getting into. So among our 4 formulations of Triclopyr, we have known the amine formulation has that danger signal word, meaning it's corrosive and can cause irreversible eye damage. Turns out that triethylamine salt is the component there that really causes the damage in your eye. The ester formulation has always had the caution signal word, causing moderate eye irritation, but no permanent damage, okay? the RTU, or the Ester formulation, which is ready to use, which is the Pathfinder, that has a caution and actually doesn't even have a label statement for eye injury. The acid formulation, so this is one of your newer ones coming in, it has the danger signal word, corrosive, causing irreversible eye damage. Very important, because this is going to come into play when we start talking about different application methodologies. And finally, the Vaslan, or the Choline formulation, has a warning signal word that can cause substantial but temporary eye injury. So you can see some changes here in the new ones. We got another danger signal word, and we have a warning signal word, where we had a danger and a caution with our early formulations. Okay, so think about this for a minute. The new 4 that was designed to replace the old 3 is safer on the eyes than the old 3, but it's not as safe as the old 4. And the new one near 3 has the same eye issues as the old 3, except now you can use it like the old 4, but it's not as safe as the old 4. So I sort of wrote these things kind of jokingly, but there's some fundamental realities here within this text, that the way you've been training your employees regarding applicator safety and specific product use is going to kind of get turned on its head a little bit if you introduce these 2 new formulations into your Triclopyr lineup. And it's very important we remember that, because people tend to get complacent or relaxed in the personal protective equipment they wear, the applicator safety approaches they utilize, and we really want to make sure that people are aware, hey, there are changes to some of these labels, and they are really important. So if you have been used to using Garlon 4 as a basal bark application, and now you're going to switch to Tricera and use that, well, you've gone from a product with a caution signal word with no issues to a product with a danger signal word with significant eye issues. So these are really, really important for the applicator to understand, okay? The PPE required by formulation is also different on the labels, okay? For Garlon 4 and Pathfinder 2, that will be your Ester formulations, long sleeve shirt, of course, long pants, shoes, and socks. Those are standard, also including chemical resistant gloves. All right, we go to Garlon 3A. We have long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, socks, chemical resistant gloves, and in this case, the addition of protective eyewear. Now, it's okay for you to use more PPE than the label requires, and I recommend always wearing protective eyewear no matter what pesticide you are applying. Go ahead and get comfortable wearing it so that you are okay when you do need to wear it. All right, and for Tricera and Vaslan, so this will be the acid formulation and the Choline formulation. In this case, all those base things with protective eyewear, and in this case with waterproof gloves, not necessarily chemical resistant gloves. So, you know, these are, I guess if you wanted to have one set of PPE that went across everything, I would use chemical resistant gloves, protective eyewear, long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, and socks, and that would have it covered, because you would be going above and beyond the most, you know, each label. You would be going to the most restrictive label there out of the Triclopyr products, and you would be okay. All right, so site use comparisons, okay, non-crop. These are all, of course, labeled in the natural areas we work in, which is a good thing. All labeled for use within forest systems. In terms of turf, not that we deal with this too much, but you can see that the Tricera acid formulation actually has some commercial turf uses, whereas the other formulations really don't in terms of Garlon 3A and Garlon 4 and Vaslan. Aquatic uses, this is important. So we've known that the Garlon 3A, or the Amine formulation with Renovate and other products, has had the aquatic label. The Ester has never been labeled for use in aquatics, nor the RTU Ester. The acid formulation has an aquatic label, as does the Choline formulation. So here we have the 2 new products coming to the table with a number of aquatic uses. So this is also going to come into play. And of course, all are labeled for use in seasonally dry wetlands. So they do have that going for them. So for example, this comes into play for things like the Ester formulation, working in seasonally dry wetlands during the dry season, when you certainly couldn't do it when when the water is up, and you would be breaking the label in that case, or violating it. Okay, now let's move on here and talk a little bit about some of the different applications. So foliar treatments for these products, because we do a lot of backpack work, a lot of handgun work, and we tend to do a lot of high volume type work with these formulations. So for high volume foliar work, we have often utilized the Amine formulation or Garlon 3A somewhere between like a 1 to a 3% on a volume to volume. Now this varies among target species. Some of the herbaceous smaller stuff, we definitely can get to the lower concentrations there. Some folks may even cut that down below 1%. And folks tend to sort of push the limits with a pretty high application rate or concentration when you get around 3% volume to volume for really waxy leaved, harder to kill shrubby type species. This has been the rate we've used for coral ardesia in Florida. But generally you may be somewhere in that range. Now for the ester formulation, it's a little bit hotter formulation, and we tend to see lower concentrations recommended when we're doing these high volume foliar treatments from the label, from about 0.5 to 1.5%. Sometimes that may be bumped a little bit higher, but in general, you'll notice it's just a little bit lower than the amine. The RTU, the ester RTU formulation, there is no foliar treatments allowed. That is strictly a cut stump and basal bark herbicide application. Do not ever use that one for foliar. You're putting out way too much herbicide. The acid formulation, you're going to come out, it's going to be around 1 to 3%. So you say it's similar to the amine formulation. You'll hear a lot of people talking about cutting this down and successfully using a lower concentration than you would for the amine formulation. Some people say you can cut it in half compared to the amine formulation, suggesting it's a much hotter version of Triclopyr, or more similar certainly to the ester formulation than it is the amine formulation. We've done quite a bit of studies here in Florida, and we have found that it certainly tends to perform a lot more like the ester formulation in terms of sort of its level of efficacy compared to the amine. The choline formulation, again, with a 4 pound per gallon, you'll see the rates typically coming in at about 0.75 to 2.25% on a volume to volume basis for high volume foliar treatments. So complete foliar coverage is still critical with all these formulations. This is one issue that's often a struggle. If you've ever seen somebody do a DOT do a side trim with Triclopyr on the roadsides, you'll see that it browns out those stems it comes in contact with, but typically doesn't tend to kill the entire tree or shrub when they do a side trim. And this also comes into play for a lot of very aggressive resprouting invasives that if you spray one side of it or the top, you often have some resprouting that you'll find from epicormic sprouts at the base of the plant the following year, especially on the back side of that. And we see that with a lot of shrubs in general. If you don't get good coverage, we definitely tend to see some resprouting from a lot of our harder to kill species. Okay, what about surfactants for all of these different formulations? Yes, pretty much yes, yes, and yes, and yes. Definitely recommending surfactants for all of them. For the acid formulation, and non-ionic surfactants recommended, and the same thing in general for the choline formulation. Those are label statements, not recommending. I mean, I'm not here to advocate for Southern Ag. I just threw a jug of a non-ionic surfactant onto the slide here. This one has 80% active ingredient, and that's typically the commercial standard. You can go higher than that. The 90% NISs are really good too. So bottom line is these formulations, they typically tend to perform a little bit better with a good surfactant and a non-ionic surfactant, especially for the acid and choline formulations. That is typically the concentration is going to depend upon the type of product you use. For a lot of NISs, you'll be at 0.25% to 0.5% volume to volume, never needing to go above 0.5. For some of the other types of surfactants that can be utilized, methylated seed oils, crop oils, that concentration often goes to 1% on a volume to volume basis. Okay, what about basal bark application? Okay, so this is what we're going to do is talk about low volume basal bark treatment, and in this case we are mixing the herbicide itself with an oil carrier, not water. So that means that should key you into needing an oil soluble herbicide that's going to mix with an oil carrier. So we like to say that the rule of thumb for basal bark applications are for stems less than 6 inches diameter at breast height, or DBH, for thin bark species, and typically stems less than 4 inches DBH for thicker bark species. And this varies, across the board. What you see here is a Brazilian pepper tree in Florida with stems that are really pushing 6 inches in diameter, and you also see it's a multi-stemmed individual that sort of gives an overall root collar diameter of about 12 inches, but stems at DBH are still under 6 inches here. So basically for the ester formulation, the commercial standard has always been a 20% on a volume to volume basis. So 20% Garlon 4, and that's on a product basis, not an AI basis. So 20% Garlon 4 in oil, and the rate range on the label or concentration is 20 to 30%. I've never seen people go to 30 very frequently. I've seen some folks go 22.5, maybe 25. 30 is pretty hot. And there's some substantial increase in cost, and it's going to reduce the number of stems on a per acre basis you can treat by 30%. The RTU formulation, or the Pathfinder 2, that's 100% volume to volume, because that is a ready-to-use formulation right out of that 2.5 gallon jug. The RTU is a great formulation to recommend to people who want to get into basal bark application for their small acreages, where they can just go buy a 2.5 gallon jug, but they don't need to buy a 10, 15 gallons of bark oil to utilize with multiple gallons of the ester formulation like Garlon 4. So the Pathfinder 2 is good. You pay a premium for it. It's much more expensive when you go ahead and buy the RTU type. Now, Tricera, I mentioned it before, this acid formulation, soluble in oil and water. The label will tell you 20.8 to 31.4% on a volume to volume basis. Those seem like some kind of weird numbers there. And it has to do with calibrating back to its 2.87 pound per gallon formulation. However, we do have a lot of applicators that are taking this 20.8 and cutting it down and utilizing a lower concentration. But in general, the importance for either the ester or the acid formulations are good coverage all the way around the circumference of every stem, typically treating a band height of about 12 to 15 inches and spraying to wet. So you can see this applicator is darkening it there. He's not flooding it. He's not pooling it at the ground level for these low volume basal bark applications. And but he's getting good coverage all the way around every single stem to effectively get good control of that individual tree there. All right, a couple of important points to consider on basal bark. So look, we say we've given you this 20% volume to volume, but the reality is a lot of applicators can reduce that Garlon 4 concentration down to about 10% volume to volume when treating smaller stems. So if you've got quite a few stems that are in that 1 to 2 inch diameter range, for many species, 10% of Garlon 4 will actually do the job nicely. So if you are treating a lot of stems pushing 3 to 4 inches for thick bark, or 4 to 6 for thinner bark, you definitely want to be up higher. But overall, it's something that you can play with as an applicator and begin to learn and recognize exactly what concentration you want to dial into based upon the job that you're doing. So there are opportunities to reduce your herbicide use. And if you can cut it down with Garlon 4, that helps you out in terms of not going past the maximum label use rate, which we'll get to that. Now, I'm in Florida now, and so yes, this may be a little Florida centric, but in Florida we've done quite a bit of work with Tricera as a basal bark treatment, and we found that we can do it at 10% on a volume to volume basis. So we can get away with that 10% concentration by treating a higher treatment band, so about 18 inches instead of 12 inches, and a slightly higher application volume, and what I will say is a very thoroughly sprayed or wet. We're not puddling the herbicide at the base of the trees, but we are going a little bit slower and a little more thorough than you would do with a blow and go Garlon 4 basal bark application. So we're finding that it can work. And now we have a lot of thin skin trees down here. We're not dealing with a lot of northern hardwoods that can be harder to kill. But overall, it's working here in Florida. And this is something that you really want to try to find out and get local information on the efficacy for species you're dealing with in other parts of the country. So a couple of things about this. If you go to Tricera for basal bark, when you cut the rate down to 10%, that's a whole bunch more oil you're using, number one. And then number two, you go to a higher band height of 18 inches, and that's even more oil you're using. So this increases your oil carrier use, but it still can reduce the total herbicide applied compared to Garlon 4 or the Triclopyr esters at 20% volume to volume. So even though, and this is because it is a 2.87 pound per gallon formulation compared to that 4 pound per gallon formulation. So you can up the volume a little bit, up the band height, and still apply about half as much herbicide with Tricera as you do with Garlon 4. Now, this really needs verification for other species across the United States. I cannot speak to a lot of troublesome invasives yet. I haven't done the testing on them outside of Florida, but it's something that I would strongly encourage you to look into, because this is a potential tool for reducing herbicide inputs into the environment and still getting very good control. Again, I'm not trying to sell Tricera, but I like to think about us getting the job done on invasive plants and minimizing herbicide inputs everywhere we possibly can. And if we can cut the rate of something and get very effective control, then and it fits our application needs and our approaches, then that's a pretty good thing in my book. Okay. Now, what about oil carriers for basal bark? Is there a best one? Historically, we've used diesel and kerosene. Diesel's still EPA approved. Okay, you can still use these things to mix with the oil soluble formulations to do basal bark. I don't recommend it. I really don't think it's a great idea putting straight diesel out into the environment around your target trees. I'd rather not do it, but the EPA still says you can do it. I tend to recommend and go with a number of different bark oils. There's a lot of good products out there that have really been designed to mix well with these herbicides and really seem to assist the herbicide in penetrating the bark. There's mineral oil type basal bark oils that are out there that are good. There's some vegetable oils, and some folks have even recommended crop oil. However, I haven't done a lot of testing with that, and I don't really have a good feel for it. Okay, big question with basal bark that comes up: can you, in standing water? And this is going to come into play here. Can you do it? All right, with Triclopyr ester. With Garlon 4, basically, this is exactly what the label says. It is permissible to treat non-irrigation ditch banks, seasonally dry wetlands, such as floodplains, deltas, marshes, swamps, or bogs, and transitional areas between upland and lowland sites where surface water is not present, except in isolated pockets due to uneven or unlevel conditions. Do not apply to open water, and it gives examples there. So this label, this is written really to put the impetus of stewardship on you, the applicator, okay? So when working in seasonally dry wetlands, and yes, there can be some surface water present in isolated pockets, but if you're doing a lot of basal bark work and you're coming upon a whole lot of water, and if you're walking around and your footprints are leaving little puddles, you have pushed the envelope and are going beyond really you're getting out of the gray area there into the area where I would say you need to shut the basal bark off with Garlon 4. So, and this is an issue, I mean, especially in many, many states where we have a lot of invasives in wetlands that are often seasonally dry, where folks can use Garlon 4 for some periods. Then it starts to rain, water comes up, and they got to shut the job off there. Now, Tricera comes to the table here with an aquatic label. There are basal bark oils. One of them is Impel Red, but there are plenty of others out there that are labeled. Actually, they say they are approved for aquatic use. Okay, so operationally, this allows a crew to keep treating, to do basal bark treatments, in wetlands in situations when the water is up. Okay, now, I'm going to tell you right now, be careful with this. Stewardship is absolutely critical. If you put concentrated herbicide, Triclopyr herbicide, into the water column, it's going to quickly move out, and any other susceptible or any other woody species or desirable species are probably going to take a beating, because they will take some of that up as it moves through the water. Now, yes, it does photodegrade in water relatively fast, but we're talking about putting a very concentrated dose of herbicide at a 10% solution of Tricera there. And we have observed non-target damage when crews have kind of abused this. within wetland situations where they have treated species and put quite a bit into the water column at the base of the treated trees, and other trees surrounding have taken it up, and we've seen damage. Stewardship is absolutely critical, and the aquatic label does not give you a license to misuse the product, resulting in excessive or tremendous non-target damage. So keep that in mind. All right. What about cut stump treatments? So yes, we've definitely got some options here. Cut stump treatments meaning we get a nice clean cut here, and we take the concentrated herbicide and we get it around the base, around the cambium here, and into the phloem, which is just the inner bark right inside, and here's the cambium ring. We don't really worry about treating the interior of the stumps here. There's nothing going on there. We don't even really worry about the xylem, but in general, just getting good coverage around the outer 1 to 2 inches circumference of the stump is really what you got to do there. So the labels are going to tell you for all of these, for the amine, for the acid, and the choline, amine, the 50 to 100%, for the acid, and choline, 100%. I'll go ahead and tell you, I think these two are overkill right here, and I think you'll be able to get away with significantly less herbicide. We've been able to take the acid down to 25 to 50% on a volume-to-volume basis. For Chinese privet, we've taken the amine formulation down to 25% and got really good control. And I suspect you can do that for a number of other species too, especially smaller diameter or smaller stemmed woody species. All of these are going to have trouble on stumps that are greater than 12 to 18 inches in diameter. So if you are sort of going after some real those just like grandfather trees that are just massive, massive trunked, tree of heavens or privets or things like that are multi-stem with a huge base, you will struggle with most of these to get complete kill, and there will often be some sprouting. But in general, we see very good efficacy with cut stump treatments across the board here. Now, if you're using the Ester formulation, the labels will very clearly tell you to treat the top of the stump and spray the sides of the stump too. Meaning it's kind of good to leave, a little bit higher stump that you can actually do a modified basal bark treatment on the sides of that stump along with the top. So I prefer, for cut stump treatments, I prefer the amine, acid, or choline formulations, but you can still utilize the ester, and it may be what you have to do. Hack and squirt. The labels are pretty straightforward in terms of continuous or overlapping hacks, using a 1/2 mil to 1 mil of product per hack. And you'll see that for the amine, that's going to come out between 50 and 100, for the acid the same, and the choline the same. And what that means is if you're applying 1 mil per hack, a 50% solution, 1 mil squirted into each of those hacks is going to work. And you can apply 100% solution at a 1/2 mil and get the same type of activity in a continuous series of hacks. You'll see some different language in terms of injection with some spacing between hacks, but overall, for hack and squirt, with a hatchet or machete, continuous hacks are necessary for the Triclopyr products. You'll also see the esters are not labeled; they're not, labeled for use for hack and squirt. Okay, so how much of these things can you put out there? So what's our max label rate? When we're doing IPT work, individual plant treatments, we really don't worry about that with hack and squirt or cut stump, because we don't typically approach label use rates in those, but we do for basal bark applications. Garlon 3A, again, we're really, the only way you're going to get to 3 gallons per acre is doing foliar treatments of an extremely hot concentration of that product where you're approaching 3 gallons per acre. For Garlon 4, that's where we do our basal bark application, and 8 pounds acid equivalent or 2 gallons per acre. We can definitely run into the max label use rate here when we're doing high density stem treatments with this basal bark technique. And a lot of you have probably run into that or pushed the limits on this in certain jobs. Things like bush honeysuckle, extremely high stem densities, you can approach that max label use rate pretty quickly. Vastland, 2.25 gallons per acre, coming in at 9 pounds acid equivalent. And Tricera, also at 9 pounds acid equivalent per acre, or 3.15 gallons of product on a per acre basis. So it's interesting that 3 of these formulations will allow you up to 9 pounds. The Garlon 4 only allows up to 8 pounds on an acid equivalent basis. Okay, so now the new 4 has a different use pattern than the old 4. So think about this, from the Garlon 4 now to Vastland, we got 2 different use patterns there. The new one that's near 3 can be used both like both the old 4 and the old 3. And it can be applied at a higher rate when using it like the old 4 for basal bark treatment. So the bottom line is your lingo and training your people to use these products may have to change depending upon the products you are shifting to. So if you shift from Garlon 4 to Tricera, you definitely got to have some shifts. If you shift from the Amine to the Choline formulation, you got to change your lingo. If you shift from the Amine to the acid formulation, you got to change your lingo. So it's really, really important to get this stuff down. Now, what about non-target issues? All right, so we've always known that for the Triclopyr ester formulation, Garlon 4 and others, basically once we start doing treatments above 85 Fahrenheit, we really start getting into trouble with volatility, and that is that volatilization occurring from a liquid to a gas, and that it then moves through the air to non-targets where it can be absorbed and cause a tremendous amount of non-target damage. And many of you have seen this with Garlon 4 type treatments. See a lot of leaf curling, leaf cupping when you're doing basal bark applications on nearby species on very hot days. Okay, so we know that now. None of the other 3 formulations really have volatility issues. So the good news is, in the heat of the summer, getting away from Garlon 4 is probably a good idea anyway, or getting away from the ester formulation, definitely a good idea. Now, what about soil residual activity, okay, and tree injury or shrub injury or other types of injury? So we've said that Triclopyr really doesn't have a lot of soil activity. The half-life can range somewhere between 8 and 45 days. In general, it's relatively short enough that at the rates we're using it, we don't see a lot of issues. However, here's a situation that we have seen injury in a number of different places now using a high concentration in one of these Triclopyr products. So like the Amine formulation at 3%, the ester formulation when you get above 2%, the same thing for the Choline possibly, and the acid formulation getting up there. 2, when you have a high concentration of those and you're using high application volumes to dense shrub canopies. So in other words, if you just got a monotypic stand of something underneath your tree canopy and you're spraying it all with a high concentration, and there's a lot of shallow overlapping roots, we have seen some issues there in terms of non-target injury. So it can happen. It's not very common in our experience, but where you have lots of shallow overlapping roots, also with basal bark applications, this is where that really comes into play, where the overlapping roots can take up the herbicide, not necessarily through root grafting, but mostly through just direct herbicide application that's inadvertent, unintended, but it can happen, and we've seen that. Now, all of these Triclopyrs, well, the ones for basal bark, so the acid or the ester, can result in what I like to call that basal ring of death. So when you put a 10 to 20% solution of Triclopyr out and you get a little bit that's going to make its way down potentially onto surrounding species or grasses, you'll often get this little basal ring of death. For grasses, they typically tend to recover and come back, later in the season or into the next year for sure. So it's not a permanent kill in most cases, but it can be a little bit of sort of surprising or unexpected damage that you might not have been prepared for. And finally, so we've talked about Tricera, and we do have some as a hotter herbicide, as a hotter formulation, and we do see a little bit of enhanced injury with Tricera to monocots that other formulations of Triclopyr really haven't tended to bother too much. In Florida, sawgrass, caladium, definitely more sensitive to the Tricera formulation. So whatever Helen has put in this thing, the formulation wise, is definitely, it's heated it up a little bit, and you have to pay attention and be careful. And just be aware that other monocots tolerating the Amine formulation may be a little more sensitive to the acid formulation. Okay, so to summarize here, we got 4 formulations really, and it's good because we have more options on the table, and that's always a good thing, more tools in the toolbox to utilize and tailor to our specific situations. So Vaseline, the Choline formulation, it brings some increased applicator safety. It's got a warning signal word instead of a danger signal word over the Amine formulation. It's a higher concentration, meaning you got to carry less product to the field, so lower volumes of herbicide you got to transport. So reduced product volume needed because of that higher concentration, and it brings the benefits of an aquatic label. Okay, so those are good things, and it's nice to have that type of tool again within the toolbox. We have limited verification of efficacy for a lot of species. The label has a few more species on there, but in general, it's going to be important that people get out looking at this to make sure that the choline formulation is going to have similar efficacy to the amine formulation. And we just haven't seen a whole lot of that type of research come out across the United States. Tricera, it brings increased flexibility. Suddenly we have a one product for all application methods, Triclopyr here. So using it for foliar treatments, mixing it with water, mixing it with oil for basal bark, utilizing it as a cut stump treatment, and a hack and squirt treatment. A lot of people have struggled with multiple Triclopyr products, and suddenly Tricera brings one-stop shopping to the market. So people may be interested in that. Eye injury issue is definitely real. This is very important if you're going to use it for basal bark, where your applicators are used to using Garlon 4 Ester type product that has a caution signal word. Suddenly they're using a danger signal word product, and it's really important they know and understand that. Again, across the country, limited verification of efficacy. The label has a few more species on it. The work that we've done here in Florida over the last 5 years has shown a comparable activity, at least to the other formulations. In a couple of cases, actually a little bit better activity on really waxy leaf species like coral ardesia. It's definitely something to pay attention to. Do not ignore stewardship if you are going to use Tricera when working in or around water, simply because it has an aquatic label. It doesn't give you a license to go and do bad things with it and over apply in aquatic situations for basal bark. Okay, let's keep it around and be good stewards if we're going to use it at all. So bottom line though, also Triclopyr ester and the amine formulations, they're still extremely useful. They're not going anywhere at this point. And so it's good to still have those, because having 4 different formulations will definitely help us in terms of the toolbox, provided we can overcome the massive amounts of confusion that can be out there. So to summarize these things absolutely as simply as I can, the new 4, which will be the choline formulation, can be used in water but cannot be mixed with oil. Okay, so that's the base statement now on that. The new one near 3, which is the 2.87 pound acid, can be used in water and can also be mixed with water or oil. So that is about as simple as I can make it in terms of those products. Okay, so again, as you train your employees, as you talk about this, one does not speak of Triclopyr without clarifying the formulation. Thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. If you have specific species you want to talk about, I'd be happy to discuss them. If you have other questions about formulations or anything like that, be happy to answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Stephen Enloe, for your awesome webinar. And thank you to the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils for sponsoring this webinar, as well as our attendees for taking the time to participate. We have about a minute where we can get to one question. We will get to that question. We will download the rest and get them to you, Dr. Stephen Enloe, for answering, and then they will be placed with the YouTube presentation once it's been uploaded. So the very first question that we had, any thoughts on efficacy of G4 Ultra for basal applications and at what rate?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, we've kind of talked through that quite a bit. For Garlon 4 Ultra, 20% on a volume-to-volume basis is literally the commercial standard for Triclopyr ester basal bark applications, treating a band of 12 to 15 inches up the base of the trunks of trees less and shrubs less than 6 inches in diameter for a thin barked, 4 inches in diameter for really thick barked type trees. That is the commercial standard, and I've used a ton of Garlon 4 Ultra and found extremely good results as a basal bark treatment. Okay.
All right. Well, let me just take over the presentation mode, because unfortunately we only had time for the one question. But as I mentioned before, we will be putting these questions along with the presentation on the YouTube channel for the North American Invasive Species Association.
Excellent.
And before I let everybody go as well, I want to invite you all to please go to NASMA.org or NISA.org for more resources, ways for you to get involved in this, spread the message and post your local invasive species awareness prevention or other on the ground or in the water events. And one last plug, we do have a save the date for our upcoming NASMA conference that we have partnered with MISC. It is going to be in Whitefish, Montana. So if any of you enjoy the mountains, please register and join us. If you have any abstracts that you would like to submit or posters for some poster session, please definitely go to NASMA.org. Thank you all again for your attendance. We appreciate having you, and thank you, Dr. Enloe, for joining us today.
Happy to do so. Have a good
Have
day.
a great day.